They hit him with outrageous fines for hunting on his own land. But this seasoned hunter didn't just fight back, he bought the HOA's cherished hiking trail and locked every gate. Permanently. Witness Luke Granger's epic revenge against a power-mad HOA president and see her kingdom crumble. You won't believe how he turned the tables. Stay tuned for the ultimate showdown. That'll be $500, Mr. Granger, payable within 30 days. Nancy Bell's voice, sharp as shattered ice, cut through the crisp October air. She stood, arms crossed, a vision in a power blue pantsuit that screamed suburban authority, right at the edge of Luke Granger's sprawling, untamed property line. Behind her, two of her equally smug HOA board members, Gerald and Susan, nodded in sanctimonious agreement, their expressions mirroring Nancy's unyielding self-righteousness. Luke, a man weathered by decades under open skies in the quiet solitude of the deep woods, merely raised an eyebrow. His land, all 200 acres of it, stretched out behind him, a tapestry of old-growth forest and rolling hills that had been in his family for 3 generations. It was his sanctuary, his livelihood in part, and most importantly, his private property. The very idea of an HOA dictating what he did on it, especially concerning something as intrinsically tied to land ownership as hunting, was laughable. Or it would have been, if Nancy Bell's eyes weren't glinting with such fervent, almost fanatical, zeal. $500 for what, exactly? Nancy, Luke's voice was a low rumble, calm but with an underlying current of iron. He'd just returned from a morning scout, his rifle safely cased and unloaded in his mudroom, his blaze-orange vest hanging on a peg by the door. He hadn't fired a shot all day. For the discharge of a firearm within prohibitive proximity to the Oak Ridge Estate's designated recreational trail, Nancy recited, as if reading from a pre-memorized script. She gestured vaguely towards a barely visible deer path winding through the trees on the far eastern edge of her own HOA's manicured domain, a trail that bordered a small, 20-acre parcel of undeveloped land separating the estates from Luke's larger property. And for creating a threatening atmosphere for our community hikers, we have reports, Ms. Granger, signed affidavits. Luke almost snorted. Threatening atmosphere, Nancy. I was on my own land, checking my perimeter fence. Haven't even chambered around today. And that trail of yours is a good quarter mile from where I might even consider taking a deer. Well within legal and ethical hunting boundaries. He knew the laws, state and local, better than she knew her HOA bylaws, which she wielded like a scepter. You have no jurisdiction here. Oh, but we do, Mr. Granger, Gerald chimed in, his tone condescending. The bylaws clearly state that any activity deemed detrimental to the peace and enjoyment of Oak Ridge Estate's residents can be subject to fines, regardless of where the originating activity takes place. If its effects are felt within our community, effects, Luke's gaze hardened. You mean the effect of a new resident, probably one of those city folks who thinks venison magically appears in cellophane at the supermarket. Hearing a distant echo and getting their Gore-Tex in a twist, Susan, her smile tight and unpleasant, added, it's about perception. Mr. Granger, and safety. Our residents, our families, have a right to feel safe when they use the community amenities. Your hobby is not conducive to that. This was the crux of it. Luke knew. It wasn't about safety. Not really. It was about control, and Nancy Bell's insatiable appetite for it. Oak Ridge Estates was her fiefdom, a place of meticulously regulated lawn heights, approved mailbox designs, and a suffocating list of thou shalt nots. Luke, with his rugged independence and his vast, untamable land, was an affront to everything she stood for. He was the wilderness at her manicured gates, a constant reminder that her dominion had an edge. His family had owned this land long before Oak Ridge Estates was even a developer's dream. They had coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with the encroaching suburbia for years. Luke had always been respectful of his neighbors, careful with his hunting practices, ensuring every shot was safe, every harvest ethical. But Nancy Bell, elected HOA president 3 years prior on a platform of enhancing community values and property prices, had made him her personal project. It started subtly passive-aggressive comments in the HOA newsletter about rural activities impacting the serene atmosphere. Then came the friendly reminders about noise. Despite his property being a natural sound buffer, now this, a direct, baseless fine. "I won't be paying it, Nancy," Luke stated flatly. "There's no legal basis for it. This is harassment." Nancy's smile didn't falter. It widened. In fact, a predatory baring of teeth. "Then we'll add late fees, Mr. Granger, and eventually a lien on your property. Our legal team is quite adept. You'd be surprised how interconnected property laws and HOA covenants can be, especially when it concerns the greater good of a planned community." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. A lien on his land for legally and safely existing on it. "You're overreaching, Nancy," Luke warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "And you're playing with fire." "Is that a threat, Mr. Granger?" she purred, her eyes alight with something that looked disturbingly like excitement. "Because we can add that to the list of infractions." Luke turned his back on them then, a deliberate dismissal. "Get off my property." He could feel their indignant stares on his back as he walked towards his modest, sturdy farmhouse. The problem had officially begun, not with the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig, but with the shrill pronouncement of a power-mad woman and the complicit silence of her board. Inside, the scent of old wood, gun oil, and brewing coffee usually brought him comfort. Today, it felt like the walls were closing in. He poured himself a mug, his hands surprisingly steady, and walked to the window overlooking the vast expanse of his land. The autumn colors were a blaze of glory, a sight that normally filled him with a deep sense of peace. Now it was tinged with a cold anger. They wanted to control him, to sanitize him in his way of life out of existence, or at least out of their sight and hearing. They viewed his traditions, his connection to the land, as a blemish on their pristine, artificial world. The cherished hiking trail they spoke of, that was another point of contention. It ran primarily through that 20-acre buffer parcel owned by an out-of-state investment company that had shown little interest in developing or selling it for years. The HOA had a lease agreement for trail access, a fact Nancy lorded over everyone as a triumph of her leadership. Hikers often strayed, sometimes deliberately, onto the edges of Luke's property, leaving litter, letting their dogs run free, assuming all undeveloped land was a public park. Luke had posted signs, mended fences, and had countless polite but firm conversations. Nancy Bell, however, seemed to encourage this sense of entitlement among the residents. Community access to nature, she called it. Luke called it trespassing. The fine was just the opening salvo. He knew Nancy, she wouldn't stop. She'd escalate. She wanted a fight, not to win a specific point, but to assert her dominance. She wanted him to bend, to break, to conform. He thought of his grandfather, who'd cleared a part of this land with his own hands, who'd taught him to hunt not for sport, but for sustenance and respect. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of a well-managed forest, the thrill of tracking a buck through the snow, the deep responsibility of being a steward of this piece of earth. Nancy Bell and her HOA weren't just fining him $500. They were attacking his heritage, his identity, his fundamental rights as a landowner. He picked up the phone and dialed his old friend, Tom Ashton, one of the sharpest land attorneys in the state. "Tom," he said. When Ashton answered, "It's Luke Granger. I think I'm going to need your services. It seems the Queen of Oak Ridge Estates has finally decided to declare war." As he explained this situation, the outrageous fines, the baseless accusations, the thinly veiled threats of a lien, he could almost see Tom's expression, a mixture of disbelief and grim understanding. HOAs, Tom had often said, were petty tyrannies in miniature, capable of inflicting outsized misery. a lien for hunting on your own land. That's ambitious, even for an HOA president with a Napoleon complex. Tom commented dryly, but don't underestimate their nuisance value. Luke, they can tie you up in legal knots and drain your resources, even if they're in the wrong. I know, Luke said, but I'm not backing down. This isn't just about a fine. Tom, this is about them thinking they can control what I do on land that's been Granger land since before their cookie-cutter houses were even a blueprint. So, what's the plan? We fight the fine, obviously. File a harassment complaint. Luke looked out the window again, his gaze sweeping over the bufferland, the land that hosted Nancy Bell's cherished trail. An idea, audacious and monumental, began to form in his mind. It was a long shot, a wild gamble, but if it worked— Tom, Luke said slowly, a new and unyielding tone in his voice, I want you to find out who owns that 20-acre parcel between my property and Oak Ridge Estates, the one the HOA leases for their hiking trail. Find out if it's for sale, and if it is, I want to buy it. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Tom whistled, long and low. Luke, are you serious? That land, if it's even available, won't be cheap, especially bordering that high-end development. I know what it might cost, Luke said, his mind racing. He had savings, carefully managed investments. This would be a huge chunk of it, perhaps all of it. But the thought of Nancy Bell's face when she realized what he'd done, it was priceless. Just find out, Tom. Find out if Queen Nancy's precious little kingdom is built on rented ground that I can own. He wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to go nuclear. He was going to take away their playground. Permanently. The fight had begun, but Luke Granger was about to change the rules of engagement entirely. The days following Luke's declaration to Tom were taught with a strange mixture of grim determination and simmering fury. The initial $500 fine notice lay on his kitchen counter, a stark white rectangle of bureaucratic arrogance. Nancy Bell, true to her word, didn't let the matter rest. Within a week, a second notice arrived, this one for $750, the original fine plus a hefty late payment penalty, and a new vaguely worded infraction, failure to comply with community standards regarding noise abatement, persistent loud activities. Luke had been splitting firewood with an axe, well within daylight hours, a seasonal chore he performed every autumn, apparently. The thud of his axe was now a community disturbance. Sleep became a more elusive commodity for Luke. He found himself pacing the worn floorboards of his farmhouse late at night, the silence of the woods outside a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. This wasn't just about money or bylaws. It was an existential threat to his way of life. The thought of a lien on his ancestral land, slapped there by an HOA he wasn't even a member of, made his blood boil. He'd always been a private man, content to live and let live. But Nancy Bell had mistaken his quiet nature for weakness. That was a profound miscalculation. The community of Oak Ridge Estates, or at least the vocal minority amplified by Nancy, seemed to be relishing the conflict. He noticed more hikers on the trail bordering the bufferland, their gazes lingering on his property with a new boldness. Some even paused directly at his property line, making a show of consulting maps or loudly discussing the disruptive hunter. One afternoon, a group of three, decked out in expensive hiking gear, let their unleashed Labrador wander 20 yards onto his land to chase a squirrel, when Luke calmly but firmly told them to retrieve their dog and respect his property boundaries. One of them, a woman with a face tight with entitlement, had retorted, "We're just enjoying nature. You don't own the squirrels, do you?" Luke had simply stared her down until she uneasily called her dog back, but the encounter left a bitter taste. This was the attitude Nancy Bell was fostering, a belief that their desire for recreation superseded his property rights. Tom Ashton called a few days later, his voice crackling with a mix of excitement and caution. "Okay, Luke, I've got the lowdown on that 20-acre parcel. It's owned by a company called Greenfield Holdings, LLC, a blind trust. Essentially, They've been sitting on it for nearly 15 years. No development plans, just letting it appreciate. Is it for sale? Luke asked, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. That's the interesting part. Tom said, officially, no, it's not listed. But I dug deeper, managed to track down a contact for the managing partners. They were based out of state, primarily deal in much larger commercial tracts. This little parcel is almost a forgotten asset to them. I floated a hypothetical inquiry, very discreetly, about potential interest in an unsolicited offer. Luke held his breath. They didn't say no. Tom continued. In fact, the guy I spoke to sounded almost intrigued, like someone had reminded him he owned a forgotten $20 bill in an old coat pocket. He said if a serious, no-nonsense offer came across his desk, they'd certainly give it due consideration. They're not emotionally attached to it. Luke, it's just a number on a spreadsheet for them. A flicker of fierce hope ignited in Luke's chest. What kind of number are we talking about? Tom sighed. That's the kicker, given its location, abutting Oak Ridge Estates, and its potential for either a few luxury homes or as a continued recreational buffer. They'd want top dollar, I'd estimate, conservatively, somewhere in the high six figures, maybe even nudging seven. If they think they've got a desperate buyer. Luke closed his eyes. It was more than he'd anticipated. It would mean liquidating nearly everything. His retirement accounts, stocks he'd inherited, the emergency fund he'd painstakingly built. It was a monumental sum, a life-altering gamble. Can we even make an offer without them knowing it's me? Luke asked. If Nancy Bell gets wind that I'm trying to buy it, she'll move heaven and earth to stop it. She might even try to get the HOA to make a counteroffer. That's where it gets tricky, Tom admitted. We can make the initial offer through a shell corporation. Keep your name out of it for as long as possible. But if they accept, during due diligence, the ultimate beneficial owner would likely have to be disclosed. However, by that point, if we structure it right, they'd be contractually obligated, assuming no major issues arise. Tom paused. Luke, this is a huge financial risk. Are you absolutely sure you want to proceed down this path? There are other ways to fight the HOA. We can sue them for harassment, for exceeding their authority. And how long will that take? Tom, Luke countered, his voice raw. Years, tens of thousands in legal fees, battling them in court, while Nancy keeps piling on fines, making my life a living hell, maybe even succeeding with that lean no. This isn't just about stopping the harassment anymore. This is about taking decisive action. This is about ending her reign over that trail. Permanently. That trail is her symbol of power, the jewel in her HOA crown. If I own the land it's on, I own her leverage. He thought of the smug faces of Gerald and Susan, the entitled glares of the hikers, and most of all, Nancy Bell's predatory smile. He thought of his grandfather's calloused hands, the scent of pine and earth, the freedom of his own land. The price was steep. Yes, but the cost of inaction, of letting them slowly bleed him dry and chip away at his spirit, was far greater. What if the HOA does try to buy it? Luke pressed. If Greenfield Holdings gets two offers, they'll just take the higher one, won't they? Would most likely. Tom conceded. Which means if we make an offer, it has to be strong and clean. Few contingencies, quick close. We need to make it more attractive than any offer the HOA could cobble together. HOAs are notoriously slow to make big financial decisions. Committees, votes, assessments, it all takes time. We can use that to our advantage. All right, Luke said, the decision solidifying in his gut, hard as granite. Draft the offer. Tom, let's aim for a price that's aggressive but not insane, and let's make it clear we're prepared for a swift, uncomplicated closing. Emphasize that. No nonsense, just like the man said. You got it. Luke, I'll set up the shell corporation first. We'll call it Granger Woodlands Conservancy, LLC, or something equally innocuous. I'll need you to transfer funds for earnest money once we have an agreement with you as the silent backer. As they discussed the financial mechanics, the sheer scale of what he was attempting settled upon Luke. He was leveraging his entire financial future on this one bold, defiant act. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Meanwhile, Nancy Bell, oblivious to the storm brewing, escalated her campaign. A third fine notice appeared, this time for an unapproved structure, a decade-old deer stand, well camouflaged and deep within Luke's property, which she claimed was visible from the recreational trail during winter months when foliage is sparse and thus an eyesore. The fine was now $1,000. She was clearly enjoying this, treating it as a game of attrition. Confident in her HOA's deeper pockets in supposed legal authority, the smugness of the HOA board members also grew. Gerald was overheard at the local coffee shop, a place Luke had frequented for years but now felt increasingly unwelcome in, boasting about how they were finally bringing that hermit Granger into compliance with modern community expectations. The narrative was being spun. Luke was the unreasonable recluse, the HOA, the bastion of civilized living. The pressure was immense. Doubt, cold and insidious, tried to creep in during the quiet hours. Was he being reckless? Was he letting his anger cloud his judgment? But then he'd picture Nancy Bell's face, the condescension in Gerald's voice, the entitled hikers, and his resolve would harden like tempered steel. They had pushed him, prodded him, and now they were about to discover the full extent of his reaction. Tom moved quickly, within days. Tall Pine Stewardship Group, LLC, they'd opted for something less directly personal than Granger was formed, and a formal offer was drafted. It was a strong offer, at the higher end of Tom's initial estimate, with a substantial earnest money deposit and a proposed 30-day closing window. The offer is submitted, Tom informed Luke a week after their initial call. It's gone to the managing partner at Greenfield Holdings. Now we wait and hope no one at Oak Ridge Estates has a direct line to them or gets suspicious about a sudden offer on that land. The waiting was the hardest part. Every passing day was a day Nancy Bell could inflict more petty tyranny, a day closer to potential legal action from the HOA. Luke tried to maintain his routines, checking his fences, maintaining his land, scouting for the upcoming deer season, but there was a constant thrum of anxiety beneath the surface. He found himself scanning the tree line more often, not for game, but for any sign of Nancy or her acolytes. The twist came not from Nancy, but from Greenfield Holdings, 10 days after the offer was submitted. Tom called Luke, his voice carefully neutral. "They've responded to our offer, Luke," and Luke's heart hammered against his ribs. "They're interested, very interested. In fact," Tom said, "our price point clearly got their attention. However, there's a wrinkle they mentioned." Almost as an aside, that years ago, they had some informal discussions with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA about the possibility of the HOA purchasing the land, or at the very least, securing a permanent easement for the trail. Nothing ever came of it. No formal offers were ever made by the HOA, but the contact at Greenfield remembers Nancy Bell specifically. He described her as quite persistent. Luke swore under his breath, so Nancy had sniffed around this before. "Here's the escalation. Luke," Tom continued, "Greenfield is willing to entertain our offer, but as a courtesy, or perhaps to leverage a better price, they've informed Nancy Bell, as president of the HOA that leases the trail, that they have received a serious third-party offer for the land. They haven't disclosed our identity or the offer amount, just that a sale is now a distinct possibility." Luke felt a cold dread mixed with his anger. "So Nancy knows the land is in play." "She does," Tom confirmed. "And according to Greenfield, she was predictably agitated, demanded to know who the buyer was, insisted the HOA should have the right of first refusal, even though no such right exists in their current lease. Greenfield told her if the HOA wants to make a competing offer, they have 72 hours to submit it. 72 hours. The clock was now officially ticking, not just for Luke, but for Nancy Bell and the entire Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Luke had wanted to take away their playground. Now he was in a direct, high-stakes race to acquire it before they could react. His bold move had just become a desperate gamble against time and a ruthless, cornered adversary. The news that the buffer land was actively being sold hit Nancy Bell like a physical blow. Her meticulously ordered world, built on the unshakable foundation of Oak Ridge Estate's perceived permanence and her control over its amenities, suddenly tilted on its axis. The cherished hiking trail, her most visible symbol of community benefit and her personal triumph, was under threat. The 72-hour deadline Greenfield Holdings had imposed felt like a ticking bomb. Her immediate reaction, after a sputtering tirade directed at the unfortunate Greenfield representative over the phone, was a flurry of frantic activity. An emergency HOA board meeting was convened that very evening. Gerald and Susan, usually her loyal, nodding lapdogs, were visibly shaken. The prospect of losing the trail and the subsequent fury of the residents was a political nightmare they hadn't anticipated. "They can't do this," Nancy seethed, pacing the community clubhouse meeting room, a sterile space that usually hosted book clubs and holiday potlucks. Tonight, it felt like a war room. "We have a lease. We have expectations." "Nancy," Gerald ventured, his usual smugness replaced by a worried frown. "Our lease is for trail access, not a right of first refusal on a sale." I've skimmed it again. Greenfield is within their rights to sell to whomever they please. The 72-hour notice is a courtesy, probably, as they said, to see if we can match or exceed the offer. "Then we match it? We exceed it," Nancy declared, slamming her hand on the polished table. "What's the offer? Did they say no?" Susan said quietly, wringing her hands. They wouldn't disclose the amount, only that it was a serious market value offer from a private investment group. "Private investment group," Nancy spat. "Probably some soulless corporation looking to clear-cut it and build more McMansions, ruining our views and our property values. We have to stop this, for the good of the community." Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the perpetually nervous HOA treasurer, a man named Arthur, who already looked like he was about to be physically ill. "Arthur, what's in the reserve fund?" Arthur paled. "Nancy, you know our reserves are earmarked for road maintenance, the pool resurfacing next year, and general landscaping. We might have perhaps 100,000 unallocated, at a stretch. But the kind of money a serious market value offer for 20 acres implies, we're talking high six, maybe seven figures. We simply don't have that liquid." "Then we levy a special assessment," Nancy snapped, "immediately, for the preservation of the Oak Ridge Trail system. Frame it as an urgent environmental and community crisis." "A special assessment of that magnitude," Gerald interjected, aghast. "Nancy, it would be thousands of dollars per household. We'd have a rebellion on our hands. People are already complaining about the current dues. And it would take weeks, maybe months, to even get a vote on it, let alone collect the funds. We have 72 hours, not 72 days. The reality of their financial impotence began to dawn, even on Nancy. Her HOA, for all its power to fine and dictate, was a Lilliputian when it came to major land acquisitions. They were structured for petty tyranny, not grand financial maneuvers. Desperation began to creep into Nancy's eyes. There has to be another way. We can negotiate with Greenfield, appeal to their sense of community responsibility. They're an out-of-state holding company. Nancy, Susan reminded her gently, their community is their shareholders. They'll take the best offer, pure and simple. A new, more insidious thought began to form in Nancy's mind. Who would want to buy that specific parcel of land? And why now? It wasn't a prime development plot in itself. Its main value was as a buffer or for limited, exclusive housing. Unless someone had a very specific, vested interest in controlling it. Her gaze, sharp and suddenly suspicious, narrowed. Granger, she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. It has to be him. The idea was outlandish. Where would a man like Luke Granger get that kind of money? But the timing, his recent defiance, his clear animosity towards her and the HOA, it fit a narrative of vindictive retribution. The thought of Luke Granger, the backwoods hermit, outmaneuvering her, snatching away her trail, filled her with a rage so profound it was almost dizzying. If it is Granger, she hissed, he's doing this to spite us, to destroy our community. We cannot let that happen. She couldn't, entertain the notion that her own actions had provoked this in her mind. Luke was the aggressor, the unreasonable party. While the HOA board flailed, Luke and Tom Ashton were in a state of suspended animation, waiting. Tom had relayed Greenfield's communication about the 72-hour window for a competing HOA offer. So the ball is in her court, for now, Luke had said, the calm in his voice belying the adrenaline coursing through him. Do you think they can pull it off? Can the HOA actually raise that kind of money in 3 days? Tom chuckled mirthlessly. For an HOA, highly unlikely. They'd need emergency meetings, votes, assessments. It's a bureaucratic nightmare, most likely. Nancy will try to bluff, threaten, or appeal to Greenfield's non-existent sense of civic duty. But Greenfield sounds like they just want a clean sale. Luke wasn't so sure Nancy would give up easily. He knew her obsession with control. The trail was her baby. He spent the next 2 days in a state of heightened awareness, expecting something. A visit, a phone call, some desperate ploy from Nancy Bell. He continued his work on his land, the rhythm of physical labor a small solace, but his mind was on the ticking clock. On the afternoon of the second day, with just over 24 hours left in the HOA's window, Nancy Bell's car appeared at the end of his driveway. She wasn't alone. Gerald and Susan were with her, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Luke met them on his porch, his expression unreadable. He didn't invite them in. Granger, Nancy began, forgoing any pleasantries, her voice tight with suppressed fury. We know it's you. Luke simply raised an eyebrow. Know what is me? Nancy. Don't play dumb, she snapped. This offer for the Greenfield parcel, it's you, isn't it? It's some kind of twisted revenge because we dared to hold you accountable for your reckless behavior? Reckless behavior, Luke repeated, his voice dangerously soft. You mean hunting legally on my own land? Or are you referring to the fine for my unapproved deer stand that's been there for 10 years? Or perhaps the one for splitting firewood? Gerald shifted his weight nervously. Mr. Granger, Nancy, perhaps we should all remain civil. Civil, Nancy whirled on him. He's trying to destroy our community. That trail is vital to Oak Ridge Estates. She turned back to Luke, her eyes blazing. You won't get away with this. The HOA is preparing a counteroffer, a very substantial one. We will not be outbid for our community's well-being. Luke listened, his gaze steady. This was the bluff Tom had predicted. He knew, and Nancy probably knew deep down, that the HOA couldn't magically conjure up hundreds of thousands of dollars in a day. Her bravado was a thin veneer over raw panic. Is that so, Nancy? Luke said, his voice calm. Then I guess Greenfield Holdings will have a decision to make. Won't they? May the best offer win. This isn't just about money, Nancy insisted, though her voice wavered slightly. It's about principle. It's about community rights over individual spite. My offer, if such an offer even exists from someone you know, Luke said carefully, choosing his words, would be a private transaction for private land. What the owner then chooses to do with that land, maintain it as a sanctuary, post no trespassing signs, perhaps even lock some gates. That would be their right as a property owner, a right you seem to have a problem respecting when it's not your own. Susan winced at the mention of locked gates. The implication was clear. Nancy's face was puce. You wouldn't dare, she whispered, the threat in her voice losing its conviction. She had come here expecting a confrontation, perhaps to intimidate him into withdrawing his supposed offer, or at least to confirm her suspicions. Instead, she found him implacable, unmoved. The balance of power was subtly shifting, and she could feel it slipping from her grasp. Her usual tactics, bullying, veiled threats, appeals to her distorted sense of community good, were having no effect. The clock is ticking, Nancy, Luke said, his eyes like chips of ice. For your very substantial counteroffer, I suggest you focus on that rather than trespassing on my property to make baseless accusations. He then turned and walked back into his house, closing the door firmly behind him. Leaving the three of them standing awkwardly in his driveway, Nancy stood there for a long moment, trembling with a mixture of rage and a new, unfamiliar sensation, fear. He hadn't confirmed he was the buyer, but he hadn't denied it either. His cool confidence was more unnerving than any angry outburst would have been. She looked at the rough, untamed expanse of Luke's land, then toward the buffer parcel, her precious trail. The thought of it being padlocked, inaccessible, was a nightmare. He's bluffing, she said to Gerald and Susan, her voice lacking its usual certainty. He has to be. Where would he get that kind of money? But even as she said it, a seed of doubt had taken root. She had underestimated Luke Granger. She had prodded a bear. And now it was not just growling, it was making strategic moves she hadn't anticipated and couldn't seem to counter. Back in the city, Tom Ashton received a call from Greenfield Holdings the next morning, the final day of the 72-hour window. Just wanted to let you know, the representative said, that the other interested party, the HOA, has officially informed us they will not be submitting a competing offer. They stated they were unable to secure the necessary emergency funding in the time frame. So, the offer from Tall Pines Stewardship Group is now the sole offer on the table. Tom relayed the news to Luke. A slow smile spread across Luke's face. Nancy's bluff had failed. Her kingdom's coffers were empty. Her power to stop him evaporated. So, Tom, Luke said, the weight of the past weeks beginning to lift, replaced by a steely resolve. What's the next step to making Tall Pines Stewardship Group the official owner of Nancy Bell's favorite hiking trail? We proceed to closing, Butch said, nice, a note of triumph in his voice. As quickly and cleanly as possible. Their desperation just handed you a significant advantage. They revealed their weakness. The power had definitively shifted. Nancy Bell had tried to fight a landowner with bylaw ammunition, and she was about to be routed. The closing on the 20-acre parcel was, as Tom Ashton had promised, swift and remarkably anticlimactic. A blizzard of paperwork signed in Tom's quiet city office. Tall Pines Stewardship Group, LLC, is now the proud owner of 20 acres of prime, undeveloped land bordering Oak Ridge Estates, Tom announced, shaking Luke's hand with a grin. Congratulations, Luke, or should I say, Mr. Steward. Luke felt a profound sense of relief, so potent it was almost dizzying. The financial commitment was immense, a vast leap of faith. But the weight of Nancy Bell's incessant harassment felt like it was already beginning to lift. He hadn't just bought land, he'd bought peace of mind, or at least the battlefield on which to secure it. He wasted no time, even before the ink was fully dry on the closing documents. Luke had commissioned the fabrication of 3 heavy-duty steel gates, far more formidable than the flimsy barriers the HOA had occasionally used for temporary trail closures. He'd also ordered a series of large, professionally printed signs: private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, entry by written permission of owner only. There was no ambiguity. The installation took place on a crisp, clear November morning, less than a week after the sale finalized. Luke, with the help of a local contractor he trusted, oversaw the work personally. One gate was placed at the main trailhead, originating from within Oak Ridge Estates, where the manicured path met the now Luke-owned buffer land. The other 2 sealed off less formal, but frequently used access points that hikers had blazed over the years. Each gate was secured with a heavy chain and a robust, weather-resistant padlock. The new signs were posted prominently at each gate and at intervals along the entire perimeter of his newly acquired property. Facing outward towards the HOA land, the visual was stark and absolute. Where there was once an inviting, if sometimes contentious, entry point to their trail, there was now an impassable barrier, a clear delineation of ownership. Luke stepped back and surveyed his handiwork. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet, resolute satisfaction. He had drawn his line, not in the sand, but in steel and ink. It took less than 24 hours for the first explosion. Nancy Bell, on her customary mid-morning community patrol, rounded the bend in the Oak Ridge walking path and came face to face with the gleaming new gate and its uncompromising sign. Witnesses later described her reaction as something akin to spontaneous combustion. Her face, already set in its usual lines of imperious scrutiny, turned a shocking shade of crimson. For a moment, she simply stared, her mouth agape, as if the gate were a hallucination. Then came the sputtering, a sound of pure, unadulterated outrage. What is this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the quiet cul-de-sac that bordered the trailhead. A few early bird hikers, equally surprised and dismayed, had already gathered. Murmuring in confusion, Nancy shoved her way through them, rattling the gate violently. It didn't budge. "This is an outrage, an abomination. Who authorized this? It says private property." Nancy, one of the braver hikers, pointed out hesitantly. "And, well, it looks pretty official." Nancy whirled on him. "Private property. This is the Oak Ridge Trail. This is our trail." She frantically dialed Gerald on her cell phone, her voice shrill. "Gerald, get down to the main trailhead immediately. Someone has barricaded our trail. It's Granger. It must be. Bring bolt cutters. Bring the police." By the time a flustered Gerald and a pale Susan arrived, Nancy was pacing before the gate like a caged tigress, launching invectives at the impassive steel. A small crowd of Oak Ridge residents had gathered, their expressions ranging from bewildered to annoyed. "Nancy, calm down," Gerald urged, clearly unnerved by the sight of the gate and the very official-looking signs. "We can't just cut it down if it's on private land." He'd had the foresight to call the HOA's own attorney en route, who had given him a very bleak, very quick assessment based on Gerald's description. If the land was indeed sold and the new owner had posted it, their previous lease was likely void, and they had no right of access. "It is our trail," Nancy insisted, her voice cracking. "He can't do this." "Actually, Madam President," a calm voice interjected. Luke Granger, dressed in his usual work attire, emerged from the tree line on his side of the new gate. He wasn't smiling, nor did he look confrontational. He merely looked like a man standing on his own property. "As the legal owner of this parcel of land, I can, and I have, this trail, as you call it, is now on private property. Access is and will remain restricted." Nancy's jaw dropped. The confirmation, delivered so plainly, seemed to momentarily short-circuit her fury. You actually bought it," she stammered, disbelief warring with dawning horror. "Tall Pine Stewardship Group, LLC bought it," Luke corrected mildly, "and I am its managing partner. Every gate is locked, every access point secured. The signs are clear. I trust they will be respected." The crowd murmured. The sheer audacity, the completeness of Luke's move was stunning. He hadn't just fought back, he'd checkmated them. But the community, the families, the hikers," Nancy sputtered, grasping for her usual emotional leverage. "You're depriving them of nature, of recreation. There's plenty of nature in the state parks and national forests." "Nancy," Luke replied evenly, "this particular piece of nature is now private, and it will be managed and conserved as frank. No more litter, no more unleashed dogs chasing wildlife, no more entitled individuals believing their desire for a stroll supersedes fundamental property rights." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled residents. I was fined for hunting legally and safely on my own land, accused of creating a threatening atmosphere. I was told my way of life was an eyesore and not conducive to community values. It seems the best way to ensure my peace, and the peace of this land, is to own it outright and regulate access myself, which means, for the foreseeable future, there is no access. Gerald looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. Susan was visibly wilting. The legal advice they'd received was clear: they had no standing. Their cherished trail, the one Nancy had touted as her great achievement, was gone, vanished behind steel gates and the unassailable rights of a private property owner. "You'll pay for this, Granger!" Nancy shrieked, her composure finally shattering completely. "Those fines are still outstanding. We'll pursue them. We'll lien your original property. We'll—" Her threats trailed off, sounding hollow even to her own ears. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The fines, once a potent weapon, now seemed petty and vindictive in the face of Luke's monumental countermove. "My attorney, Tom Ashton, will be happy to discuss those outstanding fines with the HOA's legal counsel." Luke said calmly, "I believe he'll argue they constitute a pattern of harassment, especially now, given recent developments." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the new gate. Nancy looked around wildly, seeking support, but found only shocked or averted gazes. Some residents, Luke noted with grim satisfaction, even looked faintly relieved. Perhaps not everyone in Oak Ridge Estates had shared Nancy's zeal for manufactured conflict. Over the next few days, the reality of the situation settled over Oak Ridge Estates. The HOA's attorney confirmed what they already feared: they had no legal recourse to force access to the trail. Their lease agreement was with the previous owner and did not transfer. Any attempt to remove the gates or trespass would result in immediate legal action from Luke, and likely arrests. The very substantial counteroffer Nancy had bluffed about was now a source of bitter mockery among some residents who had learned of her desperate, failed gambit. The original fines against Luke Tom Ashton had them summarily dismissed within a week, citing clear evidence of targeted harassment and abuse of HOA authority, particularly given the new context of Luke buying the land Nancy coveted. The HOA, facing potential legal costs for defending their flimsy case, quickly folded. Luke took the framed fine notices and hung them in his workshop, a tangible reminder of the battle won. Nancy Bell's downfall was swift and ignominious. An emergency HOA meeting was called, not by her, but by a contingent of furious residents who demanded accountability for the loss of the trail and her handling of the Granger situation. Stripped of her primary symbol of power and exposed as a petty tyrant who had overplayed her hand, Nancy found herself isolated. Her carefully constructed facade of community leadership crumbled. She resigned as HOA president before the week was out. A bitter, defeated woman, Gerald and Susan quietly faded into the background, their smugness replaced by a chastened silence. Life on Luke Granger's land returned to a quiet rhythm. Albeit a slightly larger version of it, he patrolled his new 20 acres, enjoying the solitude, occasionally finding and removing old litter left by years of unmanaged trail use. He found a sense of profound satisfaction in simply walking the land, knowing it was his, protected, and at peace. He posted a few more signs, smaller ones deep within his property: Wildlife Sanctuary Conservation Area. One crisp December morning, Luke was on his original property, near the border of his newly acquired parcel. In the distance, through the bare trees, he could just make out the now silent, gated entrance to what was once the Oak Ridge Trail. He unslung his rifle. He was, after all, on his own land, during legal hunting season. Engaged in a time-honored tradition, he chambered around, his movements practiced and sure. He wasn't hunting near the former trail, of course. He was a responsible landowner. But the symbolism wasn't lost on him. He had fought the HOA and their ruthless president, not with their petty rules and fines, but with the fundamental power of land ownership. He hadn't just closed a gate, He'd slammed the door on an era of arrogant overreach. The hunter, targeted and harassed, had turned the tables, buying the very ground of contention and, in doing so, had reclaimed not just his rights, but his peace. The forest was quiet again. Under the watchful eye of Luke Granger, its new and old steward. The echoes of Nancy Bell's shrill commands had faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the sigh of the wind through the tall pines.